You are listening to Specifically for Seniors, a podcast designed for a vibrant and diverse senior community. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Barsh. Join me and a lineup of experts as we discuss a wide variety of topics that will empower, inform, entertain, and inspire as we celebrate the richness and wisdom of this incredible stage of life. I am often asked how I find guests and topics for this podcast. Most of the time, there's a topic in the news that has special relevance to the safety or health of the older adult community. Sometimes it's a story of a special accomplishment. Sometimes it's just for fun. My guest today, Richard Hatch, has a story that's different and one that hasn't been told until he told it to the New York Times. But it needs to be told in his own words, right here on Specifically for Seniors. It's so good to meet you, Dick. I'm fascinated by this story. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Larry. I'm pleased to meet you as well and to be on your podcast.
Dick, you hold 2 graduate degrees in physics from Yale, but as you put it, you find it easier as a magician to violate the laws of nature than to discover them. How'd you get interested in magic?
Okay, let me first of all say to apparently violate, or to apparently to violate, if we don't want to split that infinitive. So I'm not really violating any laws, but hopefully when it's done properly, it looks like
you destroyed all my faith in magic.
I'm sorry. I got interested as a kid 2 ways. The first way was through a book, and my interest in books kind of is a lifelong thing, especially books on magic. But I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I was homesick from school, and my mother was going to go out and do some shopping at what we called then Five and Dimes. It was either a Ben Franklin store or a Woolworths. We were living in Ames, Iowa, where my father was on the physics faculty at Iowa State University. And she offered to pick me up something while she was on her errands if there was something I wanted. And I had seen a set of magnets at this store and really thought, oh, that would be fun to play with. So that was what I requested. Well, she couldn't find it. So as an alternative, she picked up a book on magic, which was the Great Merlini's Golden Book of Magic, written by the Great Merlini, which was a pen name for a very well-known at the time mystery writer. Clayton Rawson was his real name. He was editor, I think, for many years of the Ellery Queen magazine and things like that, friends with a lot of famous mystery writers. But he was also a very prominent amateur magician, and he had written a wonderful book for children on how to do magic tricks. So using that book, I put together my first little show for family and friends. And the big feat at the end of the show was I apparently sawed my brother's arms off, which I proved by pulling his shirt off, even though he was wearing a sports jacket. And that kind of set the hook initially. But the other major influence at that young age was my mother's father, my grandfather Clausen. He was a dentist in Salt Lake City, which is where both my parents were from. And he did a very few magic tricks. I wouldn't even call it a repertoire. They were more in the order of stunts. But his interest was, he was the youngest of 10 children, and his oldest sibling, 20 years older, big gap between them, had run away from home in his late teens and become a traveling showman and hypnotist in Latin America, starting in Mexico and then down other places. He eventually managed a magician, which is quite a dramatic story, but he died quite young. My grandfather was only 12. His brother was 32. And I think because he had so few visits home, the impression on my grandfather, he loomed large in my grandfather's imagination, and he encouraged my interest in magic because of his brother's involvement in it, and also at that early age in hypnosis. His brother was really more of a hypnotist, and my grandfather actually mastered hypnotism for medical use in his dental practice for people that had allergies to anesthetics that he might use. And so that was my earlier interest. Magic started, but I was more interested in hypnotism until about 5th grade when I hypnotized a kid, Brian Stuckey, at recess and stuck a pin through his anesthetized ear and was sent to the principal's office. Brian said it didn't hurt him, and he had pierced ear after that, but that was the end of my hypnotism career, and I shifted to magic after that.
And you've performed around the world in front of some famous people?
A few. I have performed in quite a few countries, based here in the U.S., obviously, and so that's the bulk of my work. But about every other year, I have a chance to go to Europe, principally Germany, because I have lots of connections there, and have performed for some well-known people. Performed at Eddie Murphy's New Year's Eve party many years ago, and there were, of course, a lot of his celebrity friends at that party, which was fun. Performed once in Houston at a party where George H.W. Bush was the guest of honor, so that was fun. And he actually had an amateur interest in magic. There was a magic store in Washington, Al's Magic Shop, no longer exists. But when he was first vice president and then president, he used to pick up tricks for his grandkids to do them, perform them himself. So we had that bond a little bit as well.
Your wife is a classical violinist, and you and she have performed together?
Yes, so we met at Yale. I was in graduate school studying physics, and she arrived the same year, but in the School of Music. We lived in the same dormitory on the same floor, and we'd share cooking duties and stuff. And I actually started taking violin lessons from her, which blossomed into eventually a romance and marriage and kids and all that. But she and I occasionally, we started this when we were still in Connecticut, a performance together with a pianist. Um, and so it's partly a concert. There's portions where there's music without magic. It's partly a magic show. There are portions where there's magic without music, particularly the audience participation portions. That's hard to choreograph to the music, but I think the most interesting and unique parts are where the magic and music are happening simultaneously. You can think of it as the magic being choreographed to the music. And that's my favorite performance, but a lot of stars have to align. You have to have the right venue, a tuned piano, 3 schedules, a bigger budget, and it just doesn't happen that often. So my bread and butter for many years has been at the opposite end of the spectrum, which is strolling close-up magic, which is appropriate in a lot of circumstances where a more formal performance would be awkward to insert. So it's like a cocktail reception. I'm not monopolizing the attention of the group. I'm going from small group to small group, keeping things festive on the sideline, just as my wife might be in a string quartet that's there not to give a concert, but to provide background music. I think of that kind of performance as background magic. It helps to create a festive atmosphere, gives people lots of fun things to talk about.
You mentioned your fascination with books on magic. Do you want to expound on that a little bit?
Well, my interest in magic started with that book that I mentioned, and I somehow became a collector at some point. You start kind of just picking up one here and there. When I was in Germany for a junior high school year, which was turned into an exchange program, but was really a family. My family and I had lived there in the 1950s when I was just from 3 to 6 years old. My father was a civilian working for the Navy in Frankfurt. And you might say, what is the Navy doing in Frankfurt? Not many large bodies of water. There's a river, of course. He was working for naval intelligence, and he was part of a team that would interview scientists who had escaped from the East. And so we were living in Frankfurt, and my brother and I, my brother's 2 years older, my brother Joe, we went to a German kindergarten. And my mother befriended a German woman, Ruth Ettengruber, whose daughter was also going to that school, kind of through a PTA type meeting. And they became fast friends, and our whole family bonded. And years later, when we were on vacation in Europe, I ended up staying behind with the Ettengrubers at their invitation to relearn the German I'd spoken as a 5-year-old by going to the German high school. Subsequently, their son, my German brother, if you will, Hans Christian Ettengruber, came and spent a year with us in Utah, going to that high school. And in the next generation, my daughter spent a year with his family, and then 2 of his kids spent a year each with Rosemary and my family in Texas. So it's gone into the next generation, and we're happy to maintain that. But I got on, we were talking about magic books. So in Germany, I'd go into every store asking for magic books. My German wasn't very good, and I couldn't distinguish between 2 words. So the German most common word for magic is Zauber, and that sounds like Tsar with a TS at the beginning. It's spelled with a Z. My ear couldn't distinguish that from Zauber with an S with no T at the front in the sound phonetically. And so I would mistakenly go into stores asking if they had Zauber, and Zauber means clean. So I would go into stores asking if they had any clean books, not knowing that I thought I was asking for magic books. And I think my worst, I finally confronted it when I went into a store which there were big X's over the bookstore, which I didn't know what that meant. And it turned out to be kind of a porno bookstore. And I was asking for clean books, and they gave me some quizzical looks. But fortunately, my German improved, as did my selection of reading material.
So now you presented a challenge for me to pronounce this correctly. In your search for interesting books on magic, you came across a book entitled Die Juden in der Zauberkunst. I get that?
Hey, Zauberkunst was pretty good. I would say Juden with a y sound for Jewish, so it's Jews in magic. And yeah, so that interest in magic books persisted. I was a first year graduate student at Yale and went to their big library, the Sterling Library, a fantastic resource, millions of volumes. At that time, this was probably in 1979 when I first got there. Nothing was digitized. This was all pre-internet computers. Everything was in a huge card catalog. It's like looking at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark and all the boxes. That's how the card catalogs were. And so I was looking for books on magic because it was my passion, my hobby. And this title jumped out at me, but for probably what turned out to be the wrong reasons. It was Die Juden in der Zauberkunst, and that means Jews in magic, would be one common way to translate it. And I'd never heard of it, but I looked in the card catalog at the date and place of publication. It was published in Berlin, Germany in 1933. Now, I'm not a historian, but I knew enough to know that Hitler had come to power in 1933, and I assumed, given the date and place of publication, that this was an anti-Semitic tract talking about what scoundrels and con artists and just generally untrustworthy people these fellows were. And so I ignored it, not being interested in reading Nazi propaganda. And that set me back a couple of years because ultimately, years later, when I had terminated my graduate studies in physics and started on a career path as a magician, one of my first projects was to translate a book from German into English that was about a 19th century magician. And he has a fun name to pronounce too, Johann Nepomuk Hofzinser. He was Viennese, lived from 1806 to 1875, and to this day is considered one of the great renovators of the art, especially in card magic, where he had lots of creations and innovations. But the book I translated was mostly about his non-card work, which was not well known in English-speaking world, which is equally creative, a great genius of magic. Anyway, as a result of having translated and published that book, I kind of look at that as my magic PhD, since I terminated my physics PhD studies, didn't write a thesis. I came to the attention of the magic community, and one of the people who had helped me in that project was a collector, not just of magic and magic books, but also of Judaica, was Jewish himself, Raphael Ellenbogen, great friend he became. And he said, if you're looking for another project, why don't you take a look at this volume? And it was the book that I'd ignored in the Yale Library, Die Juden in der Zauberkunst. And looking more closely at it, became clear I was totally wrong. It was published by the author, who was himself Jewish, an amateur magician, but a scholar of magic. And he had done it to honor the great role that Jewish magicians had played in our art, because many of the iconic figures were of Jewish heritage. Everybody, of course, knows about Houdini, and Houdini's father was a rabbi. The family originally came from Budapest to America, where his father was hired to be a rabbi in Appleton, Wisconsin initially. But a lot of the great magicians from particularly the 19th and early 20th century were of Jewish heritage, way outstripping their statistical numbers as a part of whatever population they were part of. And so he became interested in that. I was pointed out to him by his mentor, a great magician who was himself Jewish, and just in conversation, he happened to say, a lot of your idols were Jewish themselves, and that sparked his interest, and he started researching it. He was very quickly in 1933 had to terminate his university studies at the University of Berlin, and so I think he took what might have been his thesis and turned it into a self-published book, a collection of biographies of great Jewish magicians.
Who was the author?
So his name was Gunter Damman, Dammann. And only in the last couple of years have I found out things about him. I knew the basics of when he was born and when he passed away, and that he'd published this book and later two other books on on magic, but not on Jewish tradition specifically. And in digging into his background, I've been able to uncover lots about him. I actually tracked down two of his first cousins here in America, one of whom sadly has since passed away. They were both in their 90s, but the surviving cousin I'm still in touch with. He's in his mid 90s, 95 last April. And so got a lot of family background on him. But it turns out he was from a very wealthy private banking family in Berlin. They had a large mansion in the fanciest section of Berlin, Grunewald, which was sometimes known as a, a neighborhood of villas or a neighborhood of professors because of all the high profile people that lived there, upscale people. And he was one of two brothers. His parents, his mother died at age 49 in 1936, so during the Third Reich, but quite young. She died at home, but I don't have the details of what caused her death. Her husband, who was considerably older, he died a year later at age 65. Again, we don't know the cause of his death. But the three sons that survived them suffered horribly and eventually became victims of the Holocaust. Their wonderful home was forced to be sold, I'm sure for pennies on the dollar, as one would say, because they were Jewish and couldn't have that kind of property anymore. They were living then amongst friends, and they were arrested in trying to convert what assets they still had into foreign currency with the hope of emigrating to what was then Palestine. That, of course, was against law, not to emigrate to Palestine, but to convert your currency on the black market. Pretty much by that time, by the time they decided to emigrate, if you were Jewish, you had to leave everything behind. And I think coming from a wealthy background, that was a difficult thing to do. Their cousins that survived, those families who were not from Berlin, they were from the mother's side, they left everything behind, but they weren't leaving as much. And so maybe it was not as difficult for them to let go. The younger brother died in a camp called Großrosen. He's buried with his parents in a large Jewish cemetery in Berlin, Weissensee, huge cemetery. Hundreds of thousands of souls are interred there. And the cause of death is given on his death certificate. He was at this work. It was a work camp, not a death camp, but according to Wikipedia, which in this case I consider reliable, the average life expectancy of someone at that work camp was just 2 months. And that's about how long he survived there. His cause of death was given as the flu, which is very possible, but obviously the conditions were horrible. His oldest brother, who was married by then, was sent to Auschwitz, and neither he nor his wife survived. And the middle one, Gunter, who wrote this work that I've translated, he was originally, he was doing forced labor in Frankfurt, kind of slave labor, which all unemployed Jews, and most Jews by then that stayed behind were unemployed because they simply weren't allowed to work. They were forced to do slave labor. In his case, the records indicate that he was working for the Siemens Corporation at their cable work company, putting probably melted rubber on wires. Probably not the most pleasant work, but in September of 1942, he, along with almost 800 other Jews, were transported from Berlin to the city of Riga, now part of Latvia. I believe it's the capital. And according to the records, after traveling there in the cattle cars that one hears about, they weren't sent to a concentration camp. In fact, they were shot, executed upon arrival. So his body is probably part of a massive unmarked grave at the Birkini forest outside of Riga, now a World Heritage Site memorial to the victims. It has an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 bodies interred there. So a horrible, horrible end to the family. And part of my motivation is to honor his memory for having done this work of scholarship, and then at great risk to himself, published it, some would say foolishly, at the worst time and place possible.
Getting a little personal, if you don't mind, you're not Jewish. How,
I'm not.
how did you become so interested in the Holocaust and Jewish victims?
Um, I kind of thought that German Magic Society, which the magic community is kind of an insular thing because there's no one else we can talk to about what we love so much because of the secret aspect of it. If if someone who's not a magician finds out how a trick is done, they're inevitably disappointed to find out it's not really magic. They wanted to think you discovered a new principle of physics, of science, to be able to violate it, and usually it's something as simple as a piece of black thread and some double-sided Scotch tape. But that's not what they wanted to hear. They thought that they were going to learn some magic words. So that's a problem with teaching students. I don't take students before the age of 8 because they think the magic word or the magic wand is going to do it for them, and don't realize there's a lot of hard work and ingenious thought that goes into creating the illusion that magic is happening. Anyway, so I was fascinated by the German magic community, having lived there, having grown up there, having had friends there. It was like, how could this horrible thing have happened not that long ago? And how would I have behaved if I'd been there? And I can't answer that. I suspect, not being Jewish, I probably would have gone along with everybody else and done ultimately things that I could not today be proud of. Fortunately, I didn't grow up then and there, but it seemed to me that the magic community mirrored German community as a whole. There was a German magic organization, the Magic Circle of Germany, which, when the Nazis came to power, became the only officially recognized magic club. If you wanted to perform as an amateur, you had to get, it was run on the Führer principle. The president was a film producer, at that time an amateur magician based in Berlin, but quite prominent in the film industry. So his boss was Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. And he ran the organization, reorganized it on the Führer principle with him at the top. And if you were an amateur magician, to get permission to perform, you had to go through him. He also was quite proud of the fact that he was able to get a federal German law passed that made it a crime to expose the secrets of magic. And that was publicized throughout the world. Most magicians were rah-rahing it because we don't like our secrets to be exposed, but it's a clear violation of our principle of freedom of speech. We don't like it when someone tells the secrets, but they ought to be allowed to do it. Anyway, so there were Nazi magicians and there were Jewish magicians. And in 1935, with the Nuremberg laws, they had to, everybody that was a member of that organization had to reapply and certify that that they had purely Aryan heritage, that they had no Jewish grandparents. And the organization dropped at that point from, I believe, 1,400 members down to less than 400. Now, that's not because 1,000 Jewish members quit. There weren't that many that were Jewish. There were quite a few, and obviously they could no longer belong. But there were also others who felt this is wrong. You know, this is something we do for fun. And there was one club that had local branches in Cologne. The organization decided, rather than go along with that, we'll disband. We'll continue to meet privately and include our Jewish friends for as long as we can, and just not go along with what we're being told. So there aren't a lot of heroes, but to me it was interesting that the Magic Society seemed to mirror the larger German society, and I don't see that so much today. Often I won't know if my magic friends are Republicans or Democrat. Society is becoming more polarized now, so it's easier to spot certain traits and know where someone's coming from. But typically, it doesn't interfere with our relationship. But in Germany, it was impossible not to pick sides, and so that's kind of, I came into it that way. And then, of course, when I found out about this book and started a project to translate it, and the more I found out about the author, the more fascinated I became. So that's where my interest really came from.
Were the magicians who were mentioned in the book primarily German magicians and practicing magic in Germany at the time?
Many of them were, of course, because that was where he was based, the author, and doing his research. But he had access to French and American literature and corresponded with people around the world. And so it's not exclusively about German magicians. There are a couple of prominent families, the most prominent families that, in fact, weren't German. There's a dynasty of magicians, the Hermann family, that started with the father, Samuel Hermann, who settled eventually in Paris. He was an itinerant conjurer and settled in Paris. And he had a large offspring. His oldest son, who used the stage name Compars and sometimes Karl Hermann, became a magician, very prominent in Europe. And the youngest brother of that family, his youngest sibling Alexander, and again, like my grandfather, was probably about a 20-year difference between those brothers. His older brother kind of kidnapped him and took him as an assistant to St. Petersburg, and the younger brother got the bug, Alexander. and became the most prominent magician in North America, known simply as Hermann the Great. The brothers split the world between them, with the older brother getting the old world and Alexander getting the new world. And then their nephew, the grandson of the same Samuel Hermann that started the dynasty, Leon Hermann, took over in America when his uncle passed away at an early age, just 52, in 1896. And Hermann the Great in the U.S. was so prominent that newspapers editorialized with his passing that magic itself had died, which of course wasn't true, but he was so highly regarded. And they created the iconic image that persists to this day of the magician with the kind of Van Dyke beard, the goatee. They all favored that look and created that image. And of course, any magician seeing them and wanting to become like them got that look as well. So it persists to some extent to this day. Another fascinating family from Holland, the Bamberg family, it went into ultimately 7 generations of magicians. And 2 of them were very prominent at the time the book was published. Theo Bamberg was worldwide renowned at the time the book was published, performing under a Chinese stage name. It was actually a Japanese name, but he changed his character at some time to be Chinese, but kept the name. The stage name was Okito, possibly taken from mixing up the letters of either Kyoto or Tokyo. So the story goes, there are other versions of it, but he was very successful with a silent act, pretending to be Asian and doing wonderful original magic on music halls and here in the States in vaudeville. And he's not mentioned in the book, although there's a whole page on that family which mentions all the generations, but it skips him deliberately to not jeopardize his career, which was active at the time that Hitler came to power. In fact, Hitler came to power at the end of January, and the beginning of January, Okito was performing at a theater in Hamburg. I don't have any evidence that he performed in Germany after Hitler came to power, but he certainly had very deliberate omission. And his son, who used the stage name Fu Manchu, became a very popular entertainer, mostly in Latin America, starred in a number of Mexican movies, which you can still find on YouTube, and is still an iconic figure in the art. So those are non-German ones that were very prominent. And 2 of them were contemporaneous with the publisher of the book, is still active as performers. So it's interesting that reading that page, it mentions the generations, and it goes with the 5th generation, talks about him, Papa Bamberg, and it says there were 2 more generations, the young of which is David Bamberg, who performs in South America under the stage name Fu Manchu. It's like, where's number 6? There's at least one other performer that was very popular in Germany at the time, who was just not in the book at all. And we know that Damman knew about him. He wrote about him elsewhere. In fact, he contributed to a Jewish who's who that ran into 7 volumes. It was published in what was then Romania. And he included biographies of both Okito and this other performer, Arnold de Beer, in the who's who that was not published in Germany.
This is a fascinating part of the story that's really never been told before.
It's very little known, and I'm hoping that with the help of the New York Times now, that it'll come to a wider attention. And so we're looking for the translation. The straight translation is done. Our ambition is to, and when I say I have 2 publishing partners who are major collectors of magic memorabilia, and the book itself, the original book, is text only, and so it's not very pretty. I have a copy here. It was published under 2 names. Here was the original publication, which came out in August of 1933, JUDEN in der Taschenspielerkunst. That last word's kind of a mouthful, a portmanteau word, and he changed it when he reprinted it in December 1933 to the one that I discovered in the Yale Library without paying attention to it, JUDEN in der ZAUBERKUNDST. If you look at them very carefully, the minor detail, you can see that I don't know if this will get caught on camera, but the original is slightly wider and slightly taller than the subsequent one. And it's not really a new edition, although it says on the title page, 2nd edition. It's really, he took the unsold copies of the first printing, trimmed them, put in a new title page and a new cover, and then tipped in an errata sheet that says, everywhere it says Taschenspielerkunst, that should be changed to Zauberkunst. He didn't do it, he just put in the errata sheet. So it's not known how many copies he did or exactly what his motivation there was. But I'm not sure. I've lost my train of thought of where I was going with that for a second. But I got fascinated with that in about 19 83 or 4. My book was published that led my friend to say, "Hey, now that you're done with that, why don't you do?" It was published in 1985, the book about Hofzinser, and so that's probably when I started looking at this and got photocopies to work from because I didn't have an original copy of the book myself. And so there was a book published in 1990, a Who's Who in Magic, that in the entry on about Gunter Damman, the author of this book, it mentions that these two versions of the book and his two later books, and in talking about the JUDEN and the ZAUBERKUNST in parentheses, then it says English translation by Richard Hatch forthcoming. That was in 1990. So it's taken me longer. The gentleman that wrote it was murdered when he was only 32. So it's taken me longer than his lifetime to put the project together. And basically, COVID gave me the opening. Performances came to a halt, and I was looking for projects, and I thought now's the time to turn my attention back to that and finish it up. But my two publishing partners and I, our vision for the book is to make it visually interesting by adding posters and playbills and uh, other interesting visual material. Ideally, we'd love to have it be a coffee table type book. It's not clear whether that ambition would be realized, but it certainly needs to be annotated. And in fact, at the end, maybe I can find it while we're talking, put it on camera. Yeah, this won't get picked up probably, but at the very bottom of the author's introduction, right down here above my finger, you can see in English it says the lives of the Jewish conjurers. And what he's saying there is if this book finds favor, we anticipate that an expanded edition will be published in English under the name The Lives of the Jewish Conjurers. So that's our goal, is to honor his memory by doing that. We have several publishers that are interested. We're looking for the right mix, that we want to partner with someone who will uh, agree with our vision for it, and we'd like it to be, ideally we'd like it to not be restricted to the magic market. The magic community is very insular, and it'd be easy to get a good publisher who would do a nice job and get it to magicians, people interested in magic history. But I feel that the story is more important than that and should be more widely known. And ideally, and my two partners agree with me, it'd be great to have it in every bookstore, so a young 12-year-old enthusiastic magician might get it as a bar mitzvah present and get excited about his heritage, and that maybe he'll be the next great Jewish magician himself.
It's interesting on a Jewish historical basis as well, not just as magic.
I think so. I think it is people that aren't particularly interested in magic per se might be interested in the story of this subculture that. And my late friend Max Maven, whose birth name was Phil Goldstein, a great Jewish magician himself, died about 2 years ago now. He was very interested in this topic and was intending to write a book about Jewish magicians. That turned into a magazine article based on talks he gave on that. And he came up with 5 reasons why he thought people from the Jewish community that became magicians were so successful, and why they succeeded in excess of other ethnic communities that also had magicians but didn't pull anywhere the same weight statistically that the Jewish community did. It's not that different from our other fields, comedy, particularly in our American comedy culture, the film industry. There are lots of places where Jews have thrived because of their industry and abilities, and that, of course, inevitably leads to people having conspiracy theories about why that is. But I think the reasons are fairly innocent. They do well for good reasons.
So one more question.
Sure.
Do I have the beard for a magician?
It's pretty close. I would probably darken it up a bit to make it more prominent. But
Yeah.
I always see Frank Zappa, who I don't believe was Jewish, but he has that look that the Herman brothers. You'll find online images. Maybe you can post some of Alexander Herman and his brother, and you'll see that that's the image that when we think of a magician with his goatee and his Van Dyke beard, those are the guys that started that.
So you don't want to share one secret, huh?
I'll get in trouble with the union. They'll kick me out. I wish I could. My students, the first thing I make them do is sign the so-called magician's oath, and it's just one sentence. It says, "I promise not to expose." And we talk about what that word means. I promise not to expose the secrets of magic. So not just the secrets they're learning that day at the lesson, but in general, the secrets wherever they might find them out. And we spent about half an hour talking about them. The short version is what uh, we're by not telling people how things are done, we're not protecting the secrets. We're protecting our audiences from the secrets, because most people really don't want to know. They don't know that they won't want to know until they find out what the secret is, and then they wish they hadn't been told. So it's to preserve their experience of wonder and magic, which once it's gone, it's hard to get back.
I have an annoying habit of trying to figure out how it's
And that's
done.
natural. That's part of the fun. Some people don't like magic because it's frustrating, because they want to figure it out. They want to know the secret. It's not like a puzzle where you can turn to the back of the book or the newspaper and find the answer. And so they somehow find that intellectually challenging. And that's unfortunate, because I love to see things and not know how they're done, and don't have a compelling need to know in many cases. I love not knowing. And it becomes harder and harder the more knowledgeable you become about magic and its methods. It becomes harder to experience that sense of wonder. So I will go long places to watch performers that I know can give me that and recharge my batteries. But it's a natural thing to want to understand something you're seeing, especially when it appears to violate your expectations so extremely.
There was one show that we saw, platform, tiger in a cage, changed with
Okay.
magician. Okay, fine. As they were moving the stairway away from the platform, they had it turned the wrong way. And
Uh-oh.
there's the magician. So,
Yikes.
yeah,
That was something we weren't supposed to see.
one big mistake. Dick,
Yep.
this has been fascinating. This has been fun. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it as well.
If you found this podcast interesting, fun, or helpful, tell your friends and family, and click on the follow or subscribe button. We'll let you know when new episodes are available. You've been listening to Specifically for Seniors. We'll talk more next time. Stay connected.